Dr. Andreas Krieg, welcome back to The Thinking Muslim.
Thanks for having me back.
It's wonderful to have you with us. Now, we are talking on Monday evening, and of course, events are unfolding at a very rapid pace at the moment. On Saturday, the United States and Israel conducted an unprovoked and illegitimate attack on Iran. We've seen the assassination of the country's supreme leader. Many of its civilian and military leaders have also been assassinated. We've also seen Iran's retaliation, which has hit military and civilian targets, both in Israel, but also in key Arab countries. Doha, for example, has seen attacks not only on the American base there, but which is the largest US base, of course, in the Middle East. But also we've seen drone attacks on its liquefied gas installations today. And I want to talk to you about that. Now, I really want to understand the tactics and strategies of all sides, in particular whether Iran, America, and Israel possess the resilience to be able to see this war of attrition, which seems like it's becoming, through to its very end. So I want to sort of understand from your perspective, who's currently got the upper hand here, who's got the advantage when it comes to this, if any, when it comes to this conflict. Now, I would like to remind my viewers, please do contribute to these podcasts by becoming a member. Without your help, we cannot produce the programs we do. Follow the link on the screen or in the pinned comments. Dr. Andreas, let's start with the unprovoked attack on Iran. Why now?
Multitude of different reasons. Donald Trump probably doesn't know exactly why he's doing it, I would say. I think we have a very, very amateurish US administration, at least when it comes to the issue of Iran. Very clear that they have an issue with the nuclear program. That has been an issue. I mean, since Trump in his first term ripped the JCPOA, the joint, what did it stand for? The Joint Comprehensive, I don't even know what it stands for. The nuclear deal, they called it. And, it was working. It contained Iran. Iran was compliant. It was certified to be compliant, and he ripped it apart and left nothing in its place. And Iran then went into full mode of enrichment, going way beyond the threshold of what they were supposed to be doing. And obviously, they have invested heavily into their missile defense and missile offense as well. And over the last couple of years, it became clear that Iran is pivoting away towards the east, and thereby saying, we're not interested in any deal with any Western country anymore. So that's kind of the context in which Trump made these decisions. So ultimately, it's about the nuclear program, where we still don't know whether Iran wanted to have a nuclear weapon or not, but they certainly took the right steps in the direction to build one, which was alarming. Second issue was the ballistic missile program, which at least for the Israelis is a national security issue, but also for a lot of Gulf states, there was an unease about having this massive stockpile of missiles in Iran that could be used against anyone. And the third issue was obviously the axis of resistance, which has been degraded by Israel over the last couple of years since the 7th of October, which was operating as a network kind of across the entire region. And so against this backdrop, we've been seeing over the last 2 months quite a lot of activism on the side of the Trump administration to coercively force the Iranians to surrender the nuclear program, surrender their ballistic missile program, and do something about the axis of resistance. And there was this element already existed during June last year when Israel went to war. They again in early 2025, the Trump administration invested into a diplomatic sort of roadmap in trying to see whether you could have a new deal, a better deal than the old nuclear deal. And then the Israelis were the ones who upended it, unilaterally taking action that then forced the Americans to not just leave the negotiation table, but support Israel in its war against Iran. And then at the end of that war, which was kind of concluded by an Iranian attack on Qatar, the Qataris kind of translated this moment into a solution, a diplomatic off-ramp. But that off-ramp was a ceasefire. It was never really translated into a long-term diplomatic pathway to a deal because America and Trump in particular lost sight because there's obviously so many things he's doing and he doesn't have the strategic patience to see these things through. And at the end of 25, we're seeing this re-emerging, this issue about the nuclear deal and can we actually get a deal with the Iranians? And the Iranians initially weren't too keen to get involved, but then the gradual build-up, first the rhetoric of Trump and then the build-up of this armada, quite a massive force that was assembled across the Middle East, that kind of put pressure on the Iranians to say, actually, we're quite sincere now, we do want to talk. And so Oman in particular took the lead, but other Gulf states, the Qataris, the Saudis, Turks, Egyptians, everyone kind of got involved, telling the Trump administration, look, war is a terrible idea. We'll direct the whole region into a mass confrontation that nobody can control. So why don't we find a solution? And the Iranians are willing to this time around make concessions. And it's quite clear for me, if you listen to the commentary by the foreign minister of Oman, who was leading the negotiations, he made this interview on Friday night, knowing that possibly the next day something was going to happen. And he said he was appealing to J.D. Vance and to the Americans saying, look, we're quite close to a deal. We can have a deal. It's a better deal than what you had last time. It's quite clear they're agreeing to a lot of terms they wouldn't agree to last time around. But they're not talking about the missile program. The idea was, though, in the Gulf, was you kind of build a consensus around the issue of the nuclear deal, and then you build on this to kind of create a follow-up deal on ballistic missiles, and so on and so forth. And for a long time, actually, the American mediators and negotiators, Kushner and Witkoff, chief of them, were quite interested in committing to a nuclear deal. And then it became clear that the Israelis obviously were not happy with it. They weren't happy with the nuclear deal, and they weren't happy with a deal that would leave the missile program basically out of sight, out of reach. And this was a closing window for the Israelis. That's, I think, key to understand. This was a closing window for the Israelis to say, if we want to strike Iran, we want to change the regime, degrade the regime, and destroy their missile program, we have to do it now, because once you have a deal, that ship will sail. And so hence there was a lot of pressure over the last 2-3 weeks through AIPAC, through the Israel lobby and pro-Israel networks in Washington on the Trump administration and pro-Israel lawmakers in the United States to actually put pressure on Trump saying you have to take action now, because what the Iranians are offering is not enough, because they don't want to talk about missiles.
Baitul Mal has been supporting the Uyghur community for about 6 years right now. We offer support in the form of vocational training so that they are able to be less dependent, but also in terms of food support. Here we're distributing food packages in the form of vouchers to 1,000 families. Most of them are widows.
Assalamu alaikum. Bizga mish yordam qilgan Ramazonlik yordamlarni ayamay yardım qilganmish Beytul Mal iki qarindoshlarga rahmatimizni aytamiz. Doğu Turkistonlikmish yo'ldosh yo'q, yetim bolalar bizlarga Ramazonda qizilinib qolmasin deb Ramazon kelmasdilar. Bizni xotirjam qilgan bo'lsa, Alloh buni xotirjam qilsin.
Visit btml.us/thinkingmuslim to learn more and give.
How much of it was really about Iran's nuclear capabilities? Because as you said, the Omani foreign minister said very clearly that Iran had committed to completely ridding itself of its nuclear enrichment plants and technology. Many commentators have speculated that it really wasn't about its nuclear potential, nuclear capability. It really was the American and to a larger degree the Israelis who are hell-bent on conducting this particular war to degrade the Iranian state and possibly to degrade the coherency of Iran as a sovereign state.
No, that element of regime change has come in late December, early January, when we've seen these mass protests in Iran. Obviously, possibly tens of thousands of people were killed, slaughtered by the regime, which you have to call out as well. And so it's we're not saying it's a legitimate state, a legitimate regime. What they did was illegitimate, not at all. But you can't just go in and undermine the sovereignty of a state and just get rid of the regime because you don't like them. And I do think that this was a pretext. I don't think anyone in Washington in the Trump administration has a genuine concern for the people of Iran. In the same way, I don't think the Israelis have any sincere concern for the Iranian people. They couldn't care less. But it serves their overall agenda of trying to degrade regimes and creating weak countries, weak states in the region. And so that was part of that agenda. Now, Trump has used the regime change narrative in his speech, but he's gone all over the place. I mean, then we had different officials in the administration saying different things. Today, Hegseth was saying, no, it's not regime change. We're trying to degrade. Then we have leaks from the US intelligence and the Pentagon saying it's unlikely that we can achieve regime change by air power and remote standoff weaponry. So a lot of different messages coming out from Washington. And then you have Netanyahu who says, no, regime change is just around the corner because people are mobilizing. All we have to do now is basically we kick in the door and the regime will collapse. We haven't seen that so far. I personally doubt that this will be possible without boots on the ground.
Right, okay. Because how much do you believe that the Iranians do want a off-ramp here? The Omanis have said that the Iranians are willing to talk even at this late stage. I mean, do you believe that Iran is achieving what it wanted to achieve in this response to the Israeli-American aggression? Or do you feel that Iran is in a fairly weak state at the moment?
It's a complex question. I don't think the end state of this current conflict will be dictated by war. I think it will be a negotiated deal of sorts.
Yeah.
I do believe the regime will survive. It might be still called the Islamic Republic, but it's probably going to be far less Islamic and far less of a republic. It's probably going to be more of a military dictatorship run by the IRGC without a theocratic sort of figurehead as we had with the Supreme Leader Khamenei. But it will probably survive, even in a weaker, degraded state. And then you will have to strike a deal with that new regime. And Trump said, oh, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to kill these people because I don't like them. They're all baddies. And then I'm going to strike a deal with whoever is left. And then we can just return to business as usual. And it's quite clear it's now the second time around where the Iranians have come to the negotiation table, obviously June 2025, and now again. And each single time, the Israelis, and this time with the support of the Americans, have really literally, bombed the mediation team and killed a lot of the senior leaders. There's no way that Iran will just come back to the negotiation table under pressure, under duress, and say, okay, hands up high, we're surrendering, we take your dictate. I think it's quite clear that the Iranians will fight it out. They're also showing now that they've gone. If you look at Iran since the 7th of October, they were really defined by strategic paralysis. Right? There wasn't a lot going on the ground. They were hesitant to get involved, but they needed to get involved. It was mostly rhetoric. Then they said, okay, Hezbollah is going to get involved, but Hezbollah didn't really do anything. And when they did, it was half-hearted. And Israel was on the offensive. They were really living that cult of the offensive, going out and like a bull in a china shop, going out and just going and dictating the terms on the ground. So escalation, dominance, since the 7th of October was in the hands of the Israelis. And Iran was always responding to it. I think what they've done now is they said from the beginning, the Iranian regime said, look, there will be an aim of decapitation. We can talk about whether decapitation works. I don't think it works in a network state like Iran. And it's a state that has always been built around a network defense or mosaic defense, where defense is being delegated to the local level. So in this kind of state, the Iranians have said, okay, we're going to be attacked. We are giving a target list to our local commanders, to our missile commanders, drone commanders, and they will basically run through that target list across the GCC, even if they have no contact with the command and control system at the core of the Islamic Republic. And this is basically what we're seeing happening now. We saw this happening immediately after Israel and the United States attacked. The Iranians immediately went on the offensive, dictating terms, striking wave after wave, different GCC countries. Initially, it was targeting, they were saying, military installations, US military installations, but obviously the target list has now widened to such an extent that they're hitting civilian infrastructure, ports, logistics infrastructure, energy infrastructure, structures, hotels, and basically civilians writ large.
And this was a predefined list that you think that local nodes had prior to this conflict beginning.
Plus, a lot, and this is, again, loads of fog of war at the moment, right? We're 72 hours into this war.
Yeah.
The intelligence picture is very messy and blurry, but there are some reports that suggest that some of the strikes onto eastern Saudi didn't actually come from Iran. They might have come from proxies within Iraq. Right. So obviously the Iranians have also given authority to the Hashd al-Shabi in Iraq to take action. They've given authority to Hezbollah to strike, and they started getting engaged yesterday. There is an allegation that it was actually Hezbollah missiles that struck the RAF, the UK base in Cyprus. Not confirmed. But what it shows is here you've got a network state like Iran that immediately goes and delegates even as the core is being degraded and killed. And that's a very different tactic to what you would see from an authoritarian leadership. Authoritarian leadership, which is extremely hierarchical, you take the head off and everything else will collapse. What we see here is Iran is organized more like an insurgency state. It's like an insurgency group. You can't decapitate it. They have an inbuilt resilience. And that will mean they will fight, and they're in it for the long game. And so if you ask me whether Iran is now on the defensive and whether they've been weakened, they've certainly been weakened, they've certainly been degraded, but their capability to inflict damage and pain on the Gulf states, but also on Israel and on the Americans has not been diminished, at least as of now.
I mean, it's claimed that Iran has 2,000 long-range and short-range ballistic missiles, and it's got a range of pretty impressive drones that it can use to quite severe effect, as we saw with the attack on the Doha LNG plants. Do you feel that Iran has longevity there when it comes to its military advantage? It can actually keep this going for many weeks, if not months.
Well, month is, I don't think wars today in the way they're being fought are, certainly the US government doesn't have the breadth,
Really?
The logistical sort of supply chain that they need. They don't have the political will. I think the American public and lawmakers in Congress will not allow Trump to go month and months in this war. That's definitely not, they're not, there is no permissive environment for Trump to go for an Iraq 2.0. Right. And the Iranians know that. The Iranians know that this is an air power, remote weaponry-led operation with no boots on the ground. That in itself has limitations of what you can achieve. And the Americans making it clear from the beginning is like, yeah, we kind of want a regime change, but we don't want to put boots on the ground, and we kind of want to go in and out quickly, degrade a little bit, and then we can declare victory. That's not how warfare works. And certainly the Iranians have been in this insurgency mode since 1979. They've been preparing for this. They've been preparing certainly since June last year for a return to war. And hence we've seen, in June 25, we saw paralysis in the early hours, the first 24 hours in Iran. We didn't see any of that paralysis in the first hours on Saturday, and which shows that the Mosaic defense is up and running. Their supply chain of missiles obviously will deplete over time, and hence they are carefully sending missiles. They're not sending everything at once. It's a little bit here and there, because to kind of keep the Americans and the Gulfies in particular off balance is just shoot one wave of a few drones and a few missiles here and there every couple of hours to keep them going. The problem that most people don't understand is if at the moment, up until now, the Gulfies have used THUD and Patriot air defense systems, which have very, very expensive intercepting missiles. They cost millions. They cost $1.5–3 million a pop. And they're shooting down drones that are built very cheaply, these Shahed drones. They have they sound like a lawnmower if you hear them coming, like a small, I don't know if it's a diesel engine or something like that. Very cheap to produce, fairly easy to intercept. But every time you need to send a missile up, you're wasting $1.5 million. And you're thinking, okay, that's fine because they're very rich countries, the Gulf states. The problem isn't just the financial side of things, but we are in an immense shortage at the moment of munitions anyway. We've been fighting a war indirectly through Ukraine with Russia, and that has depleted our supply chains and our stockpiles, American stockpiles, NATO stockpiles. And so there isn't just enough on the market to just buy more missiles. And so that is over time is going to put pressure on the air defense systems. And we're seeing some of that happening already. So Iran can keep this going for quite some time. And they have a long breath. And if America is unable to completely destroy the missile launch capability or the drone launch capability, then we'll probably see this going. I mean, for weeks. If Iran can keep this going for weeks. And so we're now seeing that the Gulf states are moving into a more offensive posture. Instead of just saying we're relying on our air defense systems, they're now delegating a lot of it to fighter jets, attacking incoming projectiles much earlier before they even hit or come close to their urban centers. But that is also a slippery slope because you actually you're running the risk of getting dragged into direct attacks onto Iranian soil, even if you don't penetrate Iranian airspace. And so this is kind of what Israel wants to achieve, right? Israel wants to achieve a situation where the Gulf states are being sucked into this war and are being forced to support what is essentially an Israeli engineered offensive operation against Iran.
I want to come back to the Arab states and the strategy or the tactic of attacking the Arab states in a second. But I just want to come back to an earlier point you made about the Trump administration. It does seem like there is a split within the administration. J.D. Vance is talking about a very limited operation. Donald Trump spoke of regime change, which seems like a far more longer term prospect, although today he was musing that it's not going to be as long and as deliberate as he made out at the very beginning. Pete Hegseth was discussing, his line was completely different. So there's an incoherency there. I mean, do you really believe that the American administration, with all of its capacity and capability, really just does not have that level of coherency when it comes to formulating strategy under this administration?
Absolutely right. Really? The problem isn't the U.S. Capacity to do it. It's not the U.S. administration. It's not the civil service. It's not the military. Obviously, vastly well equipped. The problem is a very small group of people on the very top, most of them reality TV stars or people like Hegseth, who used to be an anchor for Fox News, who are not only not trained in this sort of statecraft and warfare, but they are overly confident in their abilities. It's like having in the UK, having people from Love Island run our administration. It wouldn't work. It's very entertaining to watch, but it's certainly not.
I haven't watched it, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Neither have I. But it's entertaining. I think it would be entertaining to have these people run our government. But it would be a train crash. And particularly, we're talking about the lives of people, livelihoods of people in the region, millions of people. There isn't an in-house strategic capability within this administration. There's a lot of ideology, and there is a lot of assumptions and grand strategic narratives, but very little in terms of translating that into feasible, attainable, acceptable, sustainable outcomes, right? This is what strategy is all about. Strategy is about how you use everything at your disposal, all the means available to generate power and influence. And Trump has got it right sometimes. I think Venezuela was a fairly successful approach because it was easy in, easy out. And it was a very hierarchical system with very limited objectives. It was clear what these objectives were. On Iran, the objectives are not, clear. Also because it's not a Trump war; it's an Israeli war. It serves Israeli interest. And I think the big problem that Trump faces now is he's fighting an Israeli-first war with an America-first administration. So you have a massive gap. And I think a growing, gap as well between the MAGA crowd, the Make America Great Again, America First crowd, and the neoconservatives who are still partially in the administration, like Marco Rubio, or in lawmakers such as Lindsey Graham, for example, who are long-standing pro-Israel neoconservatives who basically swallow any pill that the Israelis give them. And they're still there as well. And they certainly won this one. This argument was won by the neoconservatives. And the problem for Trump now is that he's getting sucked into a regime change war, and he could become a regime change president, which is something he always campaigned on. He was criticizing the Clintons, he was criticizing Obama, he was criticizing Biden, and his ticket was all about, I'm the peace president. If you go back to tweets from J.D. Vance, I think from 2024, where he says, there's no more regime change, we're learning from Iraq, and now they're feeling like, oh my God, we're getting dragged into this prolonged conflict. The other problem is if they're now going to stop, because they're saying we cannot achieve this very quickly, you end up in a situation where you leave things half finished. And that would be the worst of all worlds. I mean, the worst case nightmare for the Gulf states is a scenario where the Americans lose interest. They realize they can't achieve more degradation. They withdraw. They seek an off-ramp to sign some sort of deal. But then they leave the regime weakened. And that could then lead to maybe mass protests that the regime cannot control. And then it could lead to some long-term civil war. Mind you, Syria is a similar case. If you look at the Syrian case, it kind of was left in a limbo. Initially, the Gulf states, Qatar, Saudi, were supporting the opposition, and then gradually they were forced to withdraw that support. But then you kind of left an opposition there that was too strong to fail and to be annihilated, but too weak to actually gain ground and topple the regime. And that led to, 13 years of civil war or longer. So we don't want to get to that state. And that's kind of the nightmare scenario. And Trump does not do long-term strategy. It's all about ratings. It's about what you can sell to the public. And he's got a midterm election coming up. So that's going to be a lot of pressure on him to sell this to the American public.
Recently, I met a viewer who told me something that stopped me in my tracks. The Thinking Muslim didn't just inform him, it fundamentally changed how he sees the world. And that wasn't a one-off. A leader of the global Sumud convoy explained that one of our episodes moved him from passive viewing to meaningful action. A young man from Sudan shared that he learned English by listening to the show and is now inspired to serve the Ummah. Madrasas had integrated the podcast into their university curriculum. From day one, The Thinking Muslim was never meant to be just another podcast. It was built on a simple conviction that our Ummah deserves media rooted in faith, justice, and intellectual seriousness. Media that strengthens Iman while confronting the world honestly and courageously. We are now dubbing our content into multiple languages. We have launched new collaborations, including a program with Imam Tom Fakini and a youth-focused show for the next generation. And by taking the Thinking Muslim on the road, I have seen firsthand the hunger within our Ummah for substance, depth, and principled leadership. What comes next is even more ambitious. A history show told with meaning for today, a series on transformative figures, a political seerah, and content designed especially for children. The vision alone is not enough. To build studios, train presenters, and create professional media that can stand shoulder to shoulder with the best, we need sustained support from people who believe this work matters. Join us today, become a member at thinkingmuslim.com/membership, and help us build what our community truly deserves. Well, until now, we've spoken about the Iranian network state and its ability to be agile when it comes to this attack, this unprecedented and illegal attack on its territory. However, what has surprised me is just how much intelligence the Israelis have had about Iranian officials. I mean, the assassination, murder really of the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, is an example of that, right? Has that surprised you as to how much the Israelis and the Americans have really, they've got a granular understanding of the real-time placement of many of these officials?
It surprised me this time around. It didn't surprise me in June because obviously for years the Israelis have put massive millions and millions of dollars into acquiring and building networks, orchestrating them, finding, building sleeper cells and all that sort of stuff in Iran, informant networks. But after the war in June, a lot of these people obviously were discovered. Their cover was blown. There was massive repression by the regime against these sort of networks. And I thought they probably would have been able to find most of the moles. It's now clear that this is not the case. But it also shows how much grievance there is within Iran, how much the people are fed up. And that's not just, seculars or lefties or, it's across the spectrum of society of people saying this regime needs to go because it's not delivering for us anymore. It's not, it's people who used to cheer for the regime who no longer do so. It's middle class, lower class, upper class. It's rural areas, urban areas. It's really a broad spectrum. And if we say that, if you're being very generous, I'd say probably it's only 30% of the population who still somewhat stand behind that regime. And that has, if you're now Israel, if you're America or any other state, it gives you 70% of people who are deeply aggrieved. Then we've seen the mass slaughter of people, mostly young people in January by the regime over a few days, actually. Up to 30,000, maybe even more than 30,000 people were killed. You see the images of in the morgues where people are piling up and dead bodies. What do you think that does to a society? Everyone knows someone who was killed by the regime. So if someone now comes around and says, do you want to help us get rid of the regime, they will probably find people to do it, including people within the IRGC, including people within the Basij, which is the kind of the repressive part of the IRGC, the kind of plainclothes people who are organized on the local level. But then there is another aspect as well. It's a multi-ethnic state, Iran. There are grievances within certain secessionist groups in Iran. Yeah. There are grievances of for example, Afghans who live there as second-class citizens, who've been mistreated, maltreated, who don't have a status in the country, who, for $100 would do any kind of job. And what you need in a network is just some guy who stands somewhere and says, okay, target X, target Y is leaving the house today, reporting that back. And that gives you, and you have hundreds of these kind of people, and that gives you a full intelligence picture. Then you've got people on the inside as well who you bribed and won over. So it's not too difficult to do. And then there's obviously all the cyber technology that they have to penetrate phones and track people. And so it shouldn't be surprising, but it's still surprising how precise they were and how quickly they were able to eliminate the targets on Saturday.
And the Israeli objectives, and the Israelis seem to have a different objective, that of the Trump administration. What do you understand to be Netanyahu's aims when it comes to this operation with Iran?
Well, I mean, it's for him, it's Israel first. Obviously, it's about Israeli national security interest, and primarily what Israel wants to achieve is incapacitating Iran to no longer be able to build and use ballistic missiles. It's making sure that they can no longer financially support the axis of resistance, especially Hezbollah, and then leaving it to achieve that, Israel doesn't really need much. It doesn't need a new regime. It doesn't need a democratic regime. It doesn't need Pahlavi coming in and creating a constitutional monarchy. They don't care about this. Instability in Iran is great for Israel. Right. An incapacitated regime consumed by domestic civil war would be great because, as long as there's no missile program, as long as the air defense systems are all destroyed, Israel can come in as it pleases with impunity to strike targets as they will, as they do, for example, in Lebanon. Right? They come in, they eliminate a target and go back, no harm to Israeli fighter planes. That's what they want to achieve. And that doesn't, that can be a half-baked operation. That can be a one that leads to actual regime change. But why would you? Because regime change costs money. And after all, I think we shouldn't stop kidding ourselves that the vast majority of Iranians who want the regime gone and want Khamenei gone, they don't want to become a pawn in an Israeli sort of, in an Israeli designed regional order. That's a complete misperception.
So can we turn to the tactic of bombing neighboring Arab states? Of course, the idea initially was to target American bases in these countries, in Doha, in Qatar, in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, in UAE, of course, and elsewhere. But that has, as you've described, that has broadened to civilian targets or civilian infrastructure. And in the case of UAE, even hotels have been hit, and these are civilian targets, and actually people have been killed who are civilians. How do you assess that tactic? Like, is it because of course commentators have argued that it's to put pressure on these Arab states who do not want this level of intrusion upon their territory. And in turn, these Arab states are going to lobby the Americans to make this a short conflict. Do you buy that logic?
Obviously, it's a very flawed logic, but it's a logic. I do think that's the logic behind it. I think it's about compelling the Gulf states, putting pressure, unsurmountable pressure they can't sustain to make them compel or pressure Trump to stop this war. And that has been happening. I mean, the Emiratis, the Saudis, the Qataris, all of the Gulf states have made it very clear to the Americans over the last 72 hours that this is an unsustainable situation. Yeah. America can't really help them because they are already preoccupied with that very misconstrued operation to change the regime and degrade capabilities. But they don't also have the capacity to then also effectively defend the Gulf states. So for the most part, Gulf states are left to their own devices. And hence why we now have the UK and France and even Germany saying that they're coming to the aid and rescue of the GCC states. But the Iranian regimes, I think what is mostly flawed about this logic is that you're actually you're inflicting so much pain on the Gulf states because you're now striking the center of gravity, essentially, of their business model, right? They are all rentier economies. In Qatar, for example, Ras Al Khaimah in the north is the biggest LNG planned in the world. It supplies a lot of the gas for the UK as well. I think above 8 to 10% of what we import comes from that gas field in the UK. Some people say 40% of households use their gas from that gas field. So this is immensely significant for global energy markets. Obviously, Saudi Arabia, the biggest oil producer in the world, we've seen also targeting of their infrastructure today. Now, we see the Qatari infrastructure has gone offline today, so we have no LNG coming onto the market. We also have the Strait of Hormuz not closed, but effectively closed, because then these tankers, even if you are able to fill them up, they can't really go out through the Strait of Hormuz to actually ship that the hydrocarbon or energy elsewhere. And so you're hurting the very center of gravity of what keeps these countries alive and afloat. And yes, they do have a lot of reserves, but this is painful. This is shocking for the Gulf states. This is unprecedented. Even for Kuwait. I mean, Kuwait obviously sustained the invasion in 1990 by Iraq. This is certainly a national trauma for Kuwait. But none of the other Gulf states have sustained similar traumas. So that is going to be a national trauma. I think we are now talking about effectively the third Gulf War. And it's far more devastating for the GCC states than anything else they've seen in their relatively young history. And also it is because, we've seen strikes on, at least attempted strikes on water desalination plants, another very, very important backbone, critical national infrastructure in Qatar. We've seen strikes on Dubai Airport, Kuwait City Airport. We've seen strikes on Doha Airport that were intercepted. I mean, this is critical infrastructure for these Gulf states because, mind you, these Gulf states, what do they want to achieve? They want to be hubs in these global networks, right? Flow in commodity flows, capital, financial flows, data flows, people flows. I mean, if you look at their airlines, they're key hubs in the global network. And they need stability and connectivity. And what Iran is now effectively doing is degrading that connectivity and undermining their HAP status and undermining that stability. And that really shakes the stability of these countries to their core. And that is something that I don't think, certainly Qatar didn't expect, considering how important Qatar has been as a mediator for the Iranians. And then after all, I mean, I think what I find most surprising is that they also struck Oman, to Salalah and also Duqm Port, critical infrastructure for them. After all Oman has done, all the, sort of flack that Oman has gotten from the US and others because of their mediation role and their, alleged proximity to the Iranians.
It seems like they're lashing out.
Oh, no, I think it's a spray and pray sort of approach, right? It's like shooting in all directions. And, we always talk about, as I said before, Israel was acting like a bull in the china shop. I think Iran is acting the same way. And so what you end up with if you're in the GCC is you're kind of stuck between these two radical elements, one theocracy in Iran, and then this ethno-nationalistic state with theocratic tendencies in Israel. Both of them obviously doing whatever it takes to survive and having quite an arsenal to do that. And both of them not really interested, or at least not framing stability in the same way that the Gulf states do.
I mean, I heard you say on a Middle East Eye conversation, I think it was very recently, it was yesterday possibly, that prior to this conflict, the Arab states saw Israel as a greater threat, maybe barring the UAE, but most of the Arab states saw Israel as a greater threat than the Iranians. But of course, we've heard Washington Post this morning or yesterday, they revealed or at least suggested that the Saudis, together with Israel, were lobbying heavily in the week prior to Saturday, prior to these attacks, and the Saudis wanted a war with Iran. I mean, how credible do you think that story is?
Absolutely. I don't think that story in the Washington Post is at all credible. If you speak to interlocutors, if you speak to Saudis on the ground, officials, they're all denying it vehemently, publicly and privately. None of their actions since Saturday suggest that they have any interest in escalating this further. Quite the contrary, they've been trying to contain the Emiratis and the Qataris, saying, we're helping you out, but let's not take any steps that will lead us down a path of escalation that we cannot return from. So it makes absolutely no sense. And I think what we need to bear in mind when it comes to the Washington Post is that they fired the entire Middle East team, right? I'm wondering if it's ChatGPT that's actually writing most of their coverage. And I'm wondering who in Washington is still there to do a good journalism. This is certainly a report that most analysts don't find credible. I certainly don't find it credible because it just doesn't add up with what we've heard and seen over the last couple of months. But in going back to your point about Iran or Israel, which one is the bigger threat? It was always clear for the Gulf states that both of them are a threat. For most of them, I always said, we have a problem with Israel, and Palestine was always something that was in the back of the minds of most Gulfies, and Iran was always the threat against which they were wargaming, basically. And what happened now over the last year is that all of these worst fears have come to fruition, where Israel is striking with impunity, also striking the Gulf, hitting Qatar directly, but you also have Iran hitting Qatar directly and now hitting all the other Gulf states. And if you're sitting in Qatar, for example, you've been hit by 3 rounds of wars or 3 rounds of attacks in a matter of 8 months. Although you are trying to be the mediator and brokering deals between these different parties, and those very parties then strike you. So it really challenges their belief in and their faith in the international rules-based order, as well as intermediation and dialogue, which is what most of the Gulf states have believed in. I think for the UAE and Bahrain, they've always had a very different approach for domestic reasons. Obviously, the Emiratis always had an issue with Iran because they seized these islands during independence, during the Emirati independence, never given them back. The Bahrainis have a problem with their Shia majority on the ground, of which many of them affiliate with Iran. But even then, after the attack on Qatar by Israel in September 25, a lot of Gulfis were saying, not only are we siding with Qatar on this, but actually now it's quite clear that Israel is the most disruptive, destructive force in this region, because obviously Iran has been degraded. And true, Iran has been degraded, but obviously they still show that they have that immense capability to hurt and inflict pain. And I think the events of the last 72 hours will basically bring all these terrible traumas and fears back of saying, actually, Iran is the worst of our enemies, or at least on par with Israel.
Right. Indulge my slightly social media conspiracy theorist. Today there was the downing of 3 fighter jets in Kuwait, American fighter jets, and it was blamed on friendly fire. How credible is that?
Again, I can only speculate at this point,
Yes.
because we don't have any solid knowledge. But if you think, first of all, these Gulf states, their air defenses have been trained on their American products. They've been trained by American trainers, and they've been trained with and alongside American fighter jets. You would think that obviously mistakes aren't being made, but you're not downing 3 of them. Also, these are 3 American planes, and they're being downed fairly close to the border between Kuwait and Iran, so it could have been coming from both sides. I don't think. I'm not sure if it's a fail-safe switch on these air defense systems, but effectively for them to override all their sort of steps that are in the way that you have to go through in order to press fire and take down a jet, and then mistaking that jet for an Iranian one, when the Iranians actually only this afternoon started using fighter jets offensively. Up until now, the Iranians have used ballistic missiles and drones. To think that this was an Iranian one and they probably would have come from a different direction, I don't know. I have no evidence for that, but it sounds suspicious. And equally, I think the Trump administration has a tendency to tell half-truth or misinformation or disinformation in order to cover up their own mess, because it's not a good look. And then you have these social media posts from Kuwaitis who are picking up those parachuted pilots in the desert today. That is kind of, it has an aftertaste, let's put it that way. If you were American, it doesn't look like you're the greatest fighting force in the world.
Yeah, it's a Somali, 1994 Somalia syndrome. Also, Aramco was hit in Saudi Arabia, and the Iranians, or at least Iranian journalists, have said that it was a false flag operation. It was probably done by the Israelis. I know we're in the fog of war, but can you speculate? Like, is there a benefit for the Iranians to attack Saudi oil installations?
Well, is there a benefit in attacking any of the civilian infrastructure?
True.
The attacks on, we've seen some of the attacks, and they've been verified on Qatar, on Bahrain, on the UAE, and Abu Dhabi, Dubai, where that you cannot rationally explain. there is obviously, there's always this idea of cui bono, who benefits from that.
Yeah.
Hitting the oil infrastructure in Saudi is clearly crossing a red line. But I don't think there are any red lines anymore for the Iranian regime. They're now in full survival mode.
It's existential.
It is existential. And so it fits with the pattern of their behavior. Although the Saudis are now saying this was actually not a projectile directly hitting it. It was an intercepted projectile that fell onto their infrastructure.
Right.
We don't know. Point being is, and this is another important point, where some Iranians were saying, "Oh, the problem isn't the problem isn't the drone and our firing the drones. The problem is that there are buildings in the way of the targets that we're actually trying to hit. We didn't intend to hit them. The problem is if you operate such crappy sort of technology that the Iranians are operating in densely populated civilian areas, then this in itself is highly irresponsible and is a war crime, as blunt as that. And so that has to be called out, and there is no excuse for the Iranians. But we should go back to the point that I tried to make earlier about the network state.
Yeah.
The fact is, and this is very uncommon, so if you think about most of the militaries are pyramids, they're hierarchies, right? Top heavy, and then they basically come down. It's a clear stratification. You take basically the top down, out, and the bottom doesn't know what to do anymore. That's kind of the socialist way. And most Arab militaries are still, constructed as a socialist sort of hierarchy. The Iranians are the polar opposite. They're heterarchies, horizontally organized, revolving around the hub of the IRGC leadership, its supreme leader. But most of the stuff is being delegated out. It's delegated to non-state actors, like in the Axis of Resistance, or delegated to local organizations, Basij or IRGC offshoots, who operate the missiles and the drones, and they're doing it without any central command. What we have to realize now is that we are very likely in a situation where a lot of the local activity on the tactical level, basically people who shoot the missiles and the drones, are no longer necessarily in contact with the core of the leadership. It's very similar to what we've seen happening in Lebanon with Hezbollah in 2024. They've taken out the strategic leadership in Nasrallah, but then the local cells were still operating because they operated independently. The danger of this is they now basically maneuver quite crappy technology, but still very painful, hurtful, and devastating technology when they hit a target. Right. And they might just fire, even if the Iranian foreign minister goes on TV and says, no, we didn't do it, and we didn't want to do it. We don't intend to strike the energy infrastructure, but he's not in control. And, the government was always somewhat a parallel infrastructure to the IRGC. I mean, they don't report it to that government. But I think there is a very serious possibility that this is now a network state that is basically going into mosaic defense, which is kind of completely unhinged and very difficult to control and rein in.
Can I pivot to China? China, of course, has lost out first in access to Venezuelan oil and now access to Iranian oil. I think China imported probably most of Iran's crude oil after the sanctions regime came into place by the Trump administration, and even prior to that. So China, if I'm not mistaken, both Venezuela and Iran contributed to something like 17% last year of China's crude oil mix. I know it's hard to ascribe sort of strategic thinking to this administration, but do you believe that at least one of the aims of this administration is to erode China's energy supply as part of its sort of strategic competition with this mega state?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's not necessarily just China's energy supplies. China was hit today more than it was hit by events on Saturday.
Right.
25% of their LNG imports come from Qatar.
Yeah.
Now, Qatar stops shipping LNG gas. That will have immediate impact on energy security in China and its economy. That's devastating. And China has a massive interest in A, making sure that the Strait of Hormuz stays open, and B, that people keep on pumping oil and gas and that them being delivered out. And so they're very badly hit by events today. There is a bigger theme in there. If you speak to people in the sort of remit of the Trump administration who have that idea that the number one concern for them really is from a economic point of view is that the stability of the petrodollar. So most of the oil business is cleared in US dollars, right? And that makes the dollar such a potent currency. Venezuela and obviously Iran do not clear their transactions in dollars. They try not to. And there's a bigger push by a lot of countries in the global south and the east to say, let's use yuan or use a different currency to clear these transactions. That massively weakens and threatens the hegemony of the petrodollar. And I think that was certainly part of the consideration of why the Americans went into Venezuela. And that certainly could be another side objective of going after the Iranian regime, because clearly Iran is a resistance insurgency state that doesn't want to comply with a Western-centric, US-centric global, international, or economic order, and have had dealings with the Chinese and the Russians. But that's economics, and it's quite clear now for the Chinese, for the Russians, this is about economics. They don't care about the Islamic Republic, they don't care about the regime. They've done absolutely nothing to support them in stabilizing them. Because they also themselves are thinking, okay, they're basically an energy supplier. For the Russians, the Iranians are a competitor. So I think Russia in the short term is a clear benefactor of the current situation and disruption, because the Chinese need to get their energy elsewhere. They're likely going to go to Russia if there are any spare capacities available, because they can't go to Iran. So Russia is a key benefactor of this war right now. And that's kind of, from a UK perspective, problematic, because we're trying to weaken Russia. Clearly, the Trump administration doesn't really care. They care about China. And as I said, I think China is now being implicated in the current pressure over gas and closing the Strait of Hormuz, but haven't done absolutely nothing yet effectively to change the situation, despite a couple of phone calls.
And why do you think that is? I mean, why has China shown so much restraint, firstly over Venezuela, and now it seems like over Iran?
Because I think China wants to have a deal with the United States, and they're not trying to antagonize Washington further than they have to.
Really?
And also, there's Napoleon that once said, if your enemy is making a mistake, don't stop them, don't interfere. And I mean, America is getting into one quagmire after the other. I would say the greatest mistake that the United States have ever made is the war in Iraq in 2003. I think nothing has diminished and destroyed U.S. hegemony and U.S. unilateralism in the world than this war and the war in Afghanistan. It has bankrupted the state. It has polarized the public. It has destroyed political stability. All the problems that we see in America today can be traced back to events in Iraq in 2003. I think it was the single most devastating foreign policy decision in U.S. history. And now we're seeing a Trump administration that was going to restrain itself and focus on the Western Hemisphere and delegating out America first, getting sucked back into the Middle East because mostly due to Israel. And so that is something that the Chinese must love, because what's greater than, not only are you consuming bandwidth, because a lot of the carrier strike capability had to be pulled away from the Pacific, had to be pulled away from other areas into this part of the world. A lot of capacity is now being tied down, and China can go on doing what it wants to do. And, it's doing so in the developing world, in Africa and South America, while the United States are nowhere to be seen because their capacity is quite limited. And they're so focused on this issue now, and that might occupy them for quite some time. So if I was China, I would just sit and wait, because let's see what other mistakes Trump can make.
Great. Prior to this conflict, there was a discussion. I mean, it was Netanyahu who talked about the Sunni axis, this development of a network of states that are now far more skeptical of Israel, if not anti-Israel, and far more in tune with sort of the forces of integration within the region. And, these aren't just Arab states. It was Qatar and of course, Saudi Arabia was a new entrant to this so-called Sunni axis. But also you've got Pakistan and Malaysia and Turkey that were mooted as part of this sort of tapestry of states that are coming together and converging, as maybe Iranian power declines in the region, or at least Iranian power seemed like it was declining in the region. And there is a greater skepticism, if not worse, towards Israel and its sort of voracious ambitions in the region. I mean, how credible do you think that Sunni axis is in reality?
The big question today was, and someone from Pakistan was asking me, a journalist was asking me, what do you think with this deal in place now? Saudi is being around, they have that defense cooperation agreement
With Pakistan, yeah.
Pakistan, and Saudi is clearly under attack. Does this now mean that the Pakistanis have to deliver pilots and aircraft to fight Iran? Certainly not something Pakistan wants to do, and clearly not doing. So is it really an axis? Is it an alliance? I don't see it. There's certainly an alignment in terms of, it's negative. It's a negative integration more than a positive integration. It's what they want, what they don't want, rather than what they want. And they're all opposed to an Israeli-centric order that is being, beefed up with the support of the UAE, for example, or of Abu Dhabi. That's something that they do oppose. India is also part of this under Modi, having a very close relationship intellectually as well with Tel Aviv and also with Abu Dhabi. But then there is this counter axis, let's call it that. But it's not an alliance that seems to be pushing back against it. But then if it comes to what they actually want, how they're going to organize it, they're wildly different countries with wildly different ambitions. And I think they have overall probably some ideological alignment, also in terms of Islam, obviously. But then again, when it comes to implementation and doing things together, I haven't seen any of this yet. I haven't seen anything tangible where I'm seeing, the question can be asked now about, Iran attacking Qatar, for example. There is a defense cooperation agreement between Turkey and Qatar. Didn't see the Turks coming to their rescue. And so, we have to be very careful if push comes to shove. I mean, how much are the Turks, the Pakistanis, the non-Arab entities, Malaysia, actually doing in supporting their Gulf neighbors or Gulf partners, as it were? I don't think they're doing very much. And so Netanyahu, obviously, I think that's a scarecrow that Netanyahu has to create to kind of build that narrative of, he always needs to, it's always, everything Israel does is it always needs the significant other, the threat against which we need to mobilize. And it's something that not just Netanyahu, you've seen Bennett and others using this domestically to rally support, but it's not really existent apart from paper.
So as we close this interview, I just want to get your predictions on how you think this is going to pan out. Like what do you think the next few days, the next few weeks looks like in this sort of tense conflict really between Israel, America on the one hand, and the Iranians on the other? Like, how do you believe that? I've heard you say, and you've said it on this podcast, that it seems attritional now. It seems like, it's about who's going to blink first. The Iranian regime is far more resilient than maybe some give it credit for. How do you see things going?
No, it is a game about time and resilience, and is, as you say, is who blinks first. But time is, I think, on Iran's side. I do think the armada that Trump has built is kind of hamstrung. It doesn't have the strategic depth that it requires. It doesn't have the operational freedom that other alliances had or other partnerships that the US relied upon, even in Iraq in 2003. The fact that so far, as of today, the US is not allowed to use the airspace and air bases in the Gulf. That might change, although I don't think it will, but it might change. But as of now, they don't have that. So they need to rely on two area strike groups and basically Israel to launch all these strikes into a vast, massive country like Iran with 90 million people. It is challenging without boots on the ground. So I don't think the Americans can sustain this indefinitely. I would give it 10 days, maybe 2 weeks for the Americans to sustain it, after which they'll have issues in keeping the current operational tempo that they're in at the moment. Equally, the Israelis, there isn't a tangible outcome of this. It's not like regime change is not something you can just achieve like this. Especially regime change is not just about destroying something, it's about building something. And neither Israel nor America has the capacity or the will to build anything in Iran. So we're basically left with a vacuum potentially. But at the moment, the Islamic Republic still stands. And I think it will survive this and it will live on. What we need is an off-ramp. It will be a diplomatic solution to this. It will be one where the Americans realize they can't sustain it anymore. It will be pressure from the Gulf saying we can't sustain it anymore. We don't want to sustain it anymore. But both sides have to come up with their own victory narrative. Victory is not about something tangible. It's not what you can actually prove on paper. It's a narrative, right? And if that narrative works for your constituency, then that's all that matters. So the US, Trump has to build a narrative that works for his MAGA constituency of saying, we were victorious, we won, and it was cost efficient. The same is true for the Iranians. They have to tell their own people that they've won, that they've achieved their objectives. And despite the fact that there was some destruction, they certainly gave the Americans a bloody nose, or the Gulf states. And at the moment, because, that escalation dominance doesn't lie just with Israel and the US. The fact that the Gulf states are so vulnerable to strikes from Iran means that Iran retains a degree of that dominance, of that escalation dominance. That makes them look strong. That's something they can sell to their own constituency. They certainly are not looking defeated as of today, and I don't think they will be. And so we need to engineer a ripeness, as it were. If there is ripeness in the conflict where both sides realize actually fighting is too costly now, we need an off-ramp. An off-ramp is better than continuing this attrition. That's when it will happen. We're not at this point yet, and it requires mediators like Qatar and Oman to, put their full weight behind that effort, despite the fact that they're being bombed. And that's certainly true for Qatar. They have to now step up again, trying to build an off-ramp, trying to build relationships and a back channel while they're being targeted and their critical national infrastructure by the Iranians. It's not an easy thing to do, but that's what is required to translate this into an outcome. But I think war will have to run its course for a couple of more days, possibly a week or maybe 2 weeks.
Dr. Andreas, you said something really interesting there. I want to pick up on because one of the justifications that the Iranians use for targeting these Arab countries is that these Arab countries are used as a base against them, as a base to fire rockets and for logistics against them. Your point there is, which hasn't been given enough airtime, I suspect, on mainstream media. Your point there is actually they don't, at this moment, these bases, these army bases, these US bases in the Arab states are off limits when it comes to this conflict with Iran. Is that right?
So we haven't seen, some of them were hit on the periphery, certainly in Saudi, but they're not US bases. They are sovereign local bases with American components and international components. So Al Udeid, obviously being the biggest one in Qatar, is a Qatari base with an American component, but there are also Brits, other NATO countries operating from it. And so any destruction on it is a destruction of Qatari material and infrastructure. Same, any strike on Prince Faisal airbase in Saudi is a strike and a destruction of Saudi asset. The same for the Camp de la Paix, which is the French Navy base in Abu Dhabi, is owned by the Emiratis. It's sovereign Emirati territory.
But are those bases being used at this moment?
No, because, and then that's the key point that all the Gulf states have made, despite all the misinformation that allegedly some Gulf states were lobbying for a war. They didn't. They lobbied for the opposite. They said, we don't want this war. It's going to be destructive, because everyone in the Gulf knew that a cornered Iran would respond the way that they're responding right now. So they really wanted to avoid this. And so hitting these bases has nothing to do with the war effort. This is about pressuring and inflicting pain on Gulf partners who in the last couple of years have been very, very good to Iran. And obviously, we've moved on from that because, as I said, we're now targeting civilian infrastructures and civilians. There is absolutely no legal justification to do this. And if you're rightly calling out the Israelis for the atrocities and the genocide in Gaza and hitting civilians, you also need to call out the Iranians for hitting civilians in the Gulf.
Dr. Andreas Krieg, I think this has been a fascinating interview. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for being on.
Assalamu alaikum. Now you've reached the end of this show, and the fact that you've stayed until the very end tells me that you truly believe in our work. Please consider making a one-off donation or becoming a member by visiting thinkingmuslim.com/membership. Now, your contributions give you exclusive behind-the-scenes access and the ability to ask questions to our guests, and monthly calls with myself, my team, and our guests like Sami Hamdi. Jazakallah khair, and keep us in your du'as.